Somewhere in one of the most isolated stretches of Western Australia, something struck the Earth with the force of roughly half a megaton of TNT-30 to 40 times the energy released over Hiroshima. The object responsible is estimated to have weighed close to 14,000 tonnes of solid iron and nickel, travelling at almost 17 kilometres every second when it hit. In more than 70 years of searching, scientists have recovered barely more than a kilogram of that meteorite in anything close to its original, unweathered form. 14,000 tonnes of metal, a little over 1 kilogram found intact, the rest vaporized, scattered, buried, or simply gone, in a mystery researchers are still working to fully resolve. And that isn't even the strangest part. This impact left behind a nearly perfect ring of stone, almost 900 metres across, with walls rising high enough to swallow a 10-story building whole. It is one of the most geologically pristine structures of its kind anywhere on the planet. And for more than 60 years after European explorers first pushed into this stretch of the Kimberley through a gold rush, through droving routes, through government survey expeditions, nobody outside the local Aboriginal custodians ever recorded its existence. It wasn't found on foot. It wasn't stumbled onto at ground level at all. It took two geologists glancing down from the window of a small aircraft in 1947 to finally see what had been sitting in plain sight the entire time. This is Wolfe Creek Crater, the second largest crater on Earth from which actual fragments of the impacting object have ever been recovered, hidden inside one of the most punishing and remote landscapes in the world. Modern science is still working out exactly where the rest of that meteorite went, and exactly how violent its final seconds really were. But the Djaru and Walmatjari people, whose country this crater sits on, were already describing what happened here. The flash, the explosion, the terror in stories passed down for what may be thousands of generations, long before anyone with a survey plane ever thought to look down. Something enormous hit this place. And almost every serious attempt to understand exactly what happened next has only turned up more questions. This is the story of the hidden anomalies inside Wolfe Creek Crater. If you're new here, welcome. This channel is dedicated to the places on Earth where geology, deep history, and ancient human knowledge collide the craters, mountains, and landscapes that hide more than they first reveal. And the cultures who understood them centuries, sometimes millennia, before modern science caught up. We treat these stories seriously. No cheap scares, no invented mysteries, just what the evidence, the elders, and the researchers actually say. If that sounds like your kind of channel, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Because we're about to walk you through exactly what's really happening beneath the surface of one of Australia's strangest and most remote landmarks, and why the ancient warnings about this place turn out to be more accurate than anyone expected. To understand why Wolfe Creek Crater keeps pulling scientists back, you first have to understand exactly where it sits, and exactly what it looks like up close. The crater lies in the East Kimberley region of Western Australia, on the edge of the Great Sandy and Tanami deserts, roughly 145 kilometres south of the small outback town of Halls Creek. There is no highway to it. The only way in is along the Tanami Road, a punishing, largely unsealed track, followed by a rough, corrugated side road cut through a pastoral lease called Karanya Station. The final approach gives almost nothing away. The desert here is flat, scrubby, and monotonous, dotted with spinifex and low mulga, stretching to a shimmering horizon in every direction. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, the ground simply rises. From the air, it's unmistakable. A near-perfect circle, cut cleanly into the plain, ringed by a raised wall of broken, sun-bleached stone. On the ground, the scale is disorienting. The rim runs an average of roughly 880 metres across, with its widest point stretching to nearly 950 metres in a northeast to southwest direction a detail that itself records the exact angle at which the meteorite came screaming out of the sky. The crater walls climb 25 to 35 metres above the surrounding desert floor. And from the crest of that rim down to the crater floor today is a drop of about 60 metres. But 60 metres is not the whole story. When this crater was new, geologists estimate it plunged nearly 180 metres deep, closer to the height of a 50-storey building. Over roughly 120,000 years, wind has patiently carried desert sand into the bowl, burying more than half the original structure beneath layer upon layer of sediment. What tourists and researchers walk across today is, in a very real sense, only the upper portion of the true crater. The rest is entombed beneath their feet. Inside that bowl, the environment shifts again. The floor is largely flat, interrupted by a slight rise at its exact centre, a common feature of impact craters, formed when compressed rock rebounds upward in the instance after an explosive impact, the way a splash of water leaps back up after a stone is dropped into it. Scattered near the middle are a handful of sinkholes, and in dramatic contrast to the stunted vegetation outside the rim. Unusually tall eucalypts and acacias grow directly on the crater floor, some reaching 8 metres in height, nourished by pockets of trapped moisture the surrounding desert simply doesn't have. It creates an eerie, self-contained pocket of a different, greener world, sealed inside a wall of shattered rock. The rock that makes up the crater walls is ancient in its own right, flat-lying Devonian age sandstone and siltstone, laid down roughly 380 million years ago, back when this part of Western Australia sat beneath a shallow inland sea. That bedrock had already been sitting quietly for hundreds of millions of years before anything from space ever touched it. Recognising the site's significance, the Western Australian government formally protected the area in 1969 as Wolfe Creek Meteorite Crater National Park, preserving roughly 1,460 hectares of crater and surrounding desert. Even now, standing on the rim at sunrise, as the low light rakes across the crater's interior and throws the walls into sharp relief, it is easy to understand why this place has drawn scientists back again and again for more than 70 years. So what actually made all of this? According to the most detailed geological modelling available, Wolfe Creek Crater was formed by the impact of an iron-nickel meteorite, roughly 15 metres, across about the length of a large shipping container, with an estimated mass in the range of 14,000 tonnes. Travelling at somewhere close to 17 kilometres per second. It slammed into that ancient sandstone with the explosive force of over 0.5 megaton of TNT. At that velocity, the physics stopped behaving the way our intuition expects. The meteorite didn't simply smash into the ground. In a fraction of a second, both the projectile and a vast volume of the bedrock beneath it were violently compressed, heated past their melting points, and then released outward in an explosion that hurled shattered rock for hundreds of metres in every direction, throwing up the raised rim that still stands today. For decades, this impact's age was estimated at roughly 300,000 years. That changed in 2019, when a research team led by Professor Tim Barrows used two independent, cutting-edge dating techniques, cosmogenic nuclide exposure dating, and optically stimulated luminescence to re-examine samples from the crater rim and the sand buried beneath it. Their conclusion: the true age is closer to 120,000 years, placing the impact firmly within the late Pleistocene, and meaning humans may well have already been present on this continent when it happened. Wolfe Creek is one of only a small number of impact craters anywhere on Earth preserved well enough in terrain stable and dry enough for this kind of precision. It now ranks as the second largest crater on the planet, from which physical fragments of the original meteorite have actually been recovered and confirmed surpassed in scale only by Arizona's Meteor Crater. And it is that recovered material, more than anything else, that turns this from a merely striking landform into one of the most quietly significant meteorite sites in the world. Long before Frank Reeves ever looked down from that survey plane, this place already had a name, a history, and an explanation. The land surrounding Wolfe Creek Crater belongs to the Djaru people, sometimes spelled Djaru, and the neighbouring Wurundjeri people, whose custodianship of this country stretches back an almost incomprehensible length of time. In the Djaru language, the crater is known as Kandimalal, sometimes recorded as Kandimalal. It is not simply a landmark to them. It is a living part of what Aboriginal Australians call the dreaming the vast body of lore, knowledge, and ancestral history that explains how the world came to be the way it is, and how people are meant to live within it. This is not folklore in the dismissive sense that phrase sometimes carries. For Djaru and Wurundjeri people, the dreaming is a living legal and spiritual framework, an account of how the land was formed, who is responsible for it, and how it must be cared for, carried across tens of thousands of years without ever being written down. Kandimalal sits inside that framework as a significant and clearly powerful site. There are at least 2 dreaming narratives associated with Kandimalal, both recorded directly from Djaru elders, and both worth understanding on their own terms, without flattening them into a simple ancient myth. The first, and the one presented on the interpretive signage at the national park itself, describes 2 rainbow serpents moving across the desert in the creation era. As they travelled, their bodies carved the paths of 2 waterways that still exist today, Sturt Creek and Wolfe Creek. The crater itself marks the exact point where one of those serpents burst up out of the ground. The second story is, if anything, even more striking, and it was recorded directly from Djaru elder Jack Juggary. According to Juggary's account, the evening star passed unusually close to the crescent moon one night in the ancestral past. The heat of that encounter caused the star to fall from the sky, striking the earth in an enormous explosion accompanied by a blinding flash of light, a rolling cloud of dust, and a noise so violent it terrified everyone who witnessed it. The people stayed away from the site for a long time afterward, too frightened to approach. When they eventually did return to investigate what had happened, they found the crater and gave the place its name, Kandimalal. Juggary told researchers this account had been passed down to him from his grandfather's grandfather, a chain of oral transmission stretching back far enough that it likely predates any contact with Europeans at all. It is worth sitting with exactly how closely that story mirrors the modern scientific account. A bright object crosses the sky. It becomes catastrophically hot. It strikes the ground with enough force to produce a blinding flash, a shockwave, and a towering cloud of debris, terrifying enough that witnesses avoid the site afterward. Strip away the language of stars and moons, and you are left with what is, in essence, an eyewitness description of a hypervelocity meteorite impact, preserved and transmitted, generation after generation, for what may be tens of thousands of years, long before anyone had the tools to measure cosmogenic isotopes or model impact velocities. Whether this represents a genuine unbroken memory of the actual impact event itself, or an independently arrived at explanation for a landmark whose violent origins were simply self-evident to careful observers, is a question that sits at the edge of what any outside researcher can definitively answer. What isn't in question is this. By the time European surveyors discovered Wolfe Creek Crater in 1947, the Djaru people had already been living with a complete, coherent, and in its own way remarkably accurate explanation for its existence for an extraordinarily long time. There are other stories tied to this place too, ones that speak to features scientists would later document independently. Elders have described narratives connected to the small sinkholes near the crater's centre, tied to accounts of water at the heart of the crater details that echo the very real seasonal pools that still sometimes collect there after rain. Not every part of these stories is meant to be shared outside the community. Djaru and Wurundjeri traditional custodians have made clear, in conversations with visiting researchers over the years, that full authority over the crater's deeper ceremonial meaning rests with them alone, and that certain elements of lore connected to this site are not for outside publication. That boundary deserves to be respected here as much as anywhere else, and this video will not attempt to fill in details that are not ours to tell. What can be said, respectfully and accurately, is this: Kandimalal was never treated by its traditional custodians as a place to approach carelessly. It carried weight. It carried caution. Long before any scientific paper described the shockwave, the vaporized metal, or the towers of ejected rock, the oral lore of the people who lived alongside this crater already encoded a simple working truth that whatever happened here, it happened with terrible violence, and it demanded respect. That is a very different thing from a movie curse or a campfire ghost story. It is closer to something like an inherited safety record, carried not in an archive or a database, but in the structure of a story repeated at the right moments, to the right people, for as long as it took for someone from the outside world to finally catch up. With the science and the deep cultural history in place, here is the more immediate, documented timeline of how outsiders have encountered this crater and how its reputation and its mysteries actually took shape. In 1885, gold was discovered in the East Kimberley, triggering Western Australia's first major gold rush and drawing thousands of prospectors, drovers and speculators into what had, until then, been some of the least travelled country in the colony. Among them was a storekeeper and prospector named Robert Wolfe, who established himself near the boom town that would become Halls Creek, and who unknowingly lent his name to a nearby creek that, decades later, would in turn be attached to this crater. Halls Creek itself became Western Australia's first true gold rush boomtown, swelling almost overnight with prospectors chasing rumours of payable gold. The ruins of that era still stand today, weathered mud brick walls slowly dissolving back into the landscape a short drive from the modern town. For more than 60 years afterward, European explorers, cattle drovers and government surveyors moved through this general region without a single documented mention of a 900-metre impact structure sitting within striking distance of their routes. That is not, on its own, sinister. It's a simple, almost humbling fact about the scale and monotony of this landscape at ground level. In flat, featureless scrubland, a rim rising only 25 to 35 metres above the plain can vanish into the horizon from just a few hundred metres away. You could walk to within sight of Wolfe Creek Crater in the 1800s and never know it was there. For 6 decades, that is exactly what happened. That blind spot ended in 1947, when geologist Frank Reeves, working alongside colleague B, Sorve and pilot Dudley Hart, flew an aerial survey of the region on behalf of an oil exploration company. Scanning the desert below for signs of useful geology, Reeves spotted something that had no business being there, a near-perfect ring carved into the desert floor, almost a kilometre across. It took roughly 2 months to organise and complete a ground expedition capable of actually reaching the site, a measure of just how remote and difficult this country still was, even with 1940s vehicles and equipment. When the team finally stood on the rim, they confirmed what Reeves had suspected from the air. This was no ordinary landform. The findings were formally published in 1949, and the crater was named after the nearby creek misspelled in some of the earliest reports as Wolfe Creek, a spelling that would, decades later, take on a very different kind of significance. Confirming that Wolfe Creek was a genuine impact site required physical evidence, and that set off a series of scientific expeditions through the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. In 1954, researcher William Cassidy led an expedition that recovered more than 600 pounds of heavily oxidised meteoritic material from the crater's southwestern slope, including 3 unusually large masses, each weighing well over 300 pounds, nearly 100 times larger than anything found there before. These rust-red weathered lumps became known as shale balls, the deeply altered oxidised remnants of the original iron-nickel meteorite, chemically transformed almost beyond recognition after tens of thousands of years buried in the ground. Analysis of these fragments turned up something else remarkable, a nickel-iron carbonate mineral, never before recorded anywhere on Earth. It was named reevesite, in honour of Frank Reeves, the geologist who first spotted the crater from the air. But here is where the real mystery deepens. Across 70 years of expeditions, the total volume of meteoritic material recovered from Wolfe Creek, almost entirely in this heavily weathered shale ball form, adds up to only a few thousand kilograms. Fresh, unweathered metal, the kind that would let scientists study the meteorite in something close to its original state, has been almost impossible to find. Early studies collected barely more than a single kilogram of it. Against an impactor estimated at 14,000 tonnes, that is a difference of roughly 10 million to 1. The leading scientific explanation is that the extreme heat of impact vaporised the overwhelming majority of the meteorite instantly, while the small remaining fragments have spent well over 100,000 years being slowly consumed by oxidation in the desert soil. It is a satisfying explanation on paper, but it has never stopped researchers from continuing to search and continuing to publish on exactly how much of that original mass can actually be accounted for. The fourth major turning point in this crater story has nothing to do with geology at all. In 2005, Australian director Greg McLean released a horror film titled Wolfe Creek, Deliberately Misspelled, following a group of backpackers stalked by a fictional killer after their car breaks down near the crater. The film used genuine aerial footage of the real Wolfe Creek Crater in its opening act, then relocated production almost entirely to South Australia for the rest of the shoot. Marketing for the film leaned heavily on the phrase based on true events, a claim that was, at best, a significant stretch. McLean has said the film's plot drew loose, general inspiration from Australia's broader, well-documented history of violent crimes against travellers in remote areas, but no murder, disappearance, or crime of any kind has ever been recorded at the actual crater. The film is, in the most literal sense, fiction wrapped around a real and striking location. That distinction did not stop the crater's reputation from transforming almost overnight. In the years since the film's release, park rangers and tourism operators have reported a noticeable shift. Some visitors arrive specifically hoping to experience the site's horror movie notoriety, while others cancel trips altogether, uneasy about a place they've only ever encountered through a fictional killer's rearview mirror. Australian tourism authorities have publicly acknowledged that this unease is real, even while confirming, just as clearly, that it has no basis in the crater's actual history. According to tourism figures, the crater still draws thousands of visitors a year, many of them, whether they'd admit it or not, pulled in at least partly by the very reputation the film created. If you're waiting for this to turn into a story about aliens, curses, or something science can't explain, keep watching. Because what researchers have actually confirmed at Wolfe Creek Crater is stranger, and in some ways far more unsettling than any of that. A real, measurable anomaly really does sit beneath this crater's floor. The question is what's actually causing it, and why decades of rumours got the explanation so completely wrong. Before we get there, if you're enjoying this, kind of deep dive into the places where geology and ancient history collide. Now's a great time to hit subscribe. We post new investigations like this one regularly, and you won't want to miss what comes next. Once a location picks up a reputation like Wolfe Creek Craters, the internet tends to do the rest of the work on its own. In online forums, comment sections, and amateur mystery videos, a familiar set of theories has attached itself to this crater over the past 2 decades. Some posts speculate it might mark an alien landing site, a theory applied, with almost no variation, to virtually every unusually perfect circular structure on the planet, from craters to sinkholes to crop circles. Others lean into the Australian Bermuda Triangle framing, borrowing the language of the film to imply the crater itself is somehow cursed or haunted, a place where travellers vanish without explanation. and a smaller but persistent thread of speculation centres on claims of unexplained compass deviations and equipment malfunctions near the site, framed online as evidence of something paranormal, or even extraterrestrial happening beneath the surface. It's worth taking each of these seriously enough to actually check them against the evidence, because the real answers turn out to be more interesting and more revealing than the rumours. The alien impact theory collapses almost immediately under basic geology. Wolfe Creek displays every hallmark of a conventional, well-understood hypervelocity meteorite impact. A raised, overturned rim of shattered bedrock, a blanket of ejected material surrounding the structure, and, most conclusively, actual fragments of the meteorite itself, chemically confirmed as an iron-nickel object through decades of laboratory analysis. Impact craters with this exact structural signature exist all over the world, from Arizona to Argentina to Estonia. There is nothing about Wolfe Creek's formation that departs from ordinary, well-documented physics. The cursed ground framing traces back almost entirely to the 2005 film, and its marketing, as we've already covered a fictional story, using a real backdrop that borrowed just enough language of authenticity to blur the line for casual viewers. No missing persons case, criminal investigation, or unexplained disappearance has ever been documented at the crater. What is documented is a horror movie's cultural footprint, which is a very different and far more mundane kind of mystery. That leaves the compass and magnetic anomaly claims, and this is where the story gets genuinely interesting, because unlike the other two, this rumour is actually rooted in something real. In 2003, research teams conducted detailed ground-based magnetic and gravity surveys directly across the crater, mapping its subsurface structure in careful detail. Their results confirmed something notable. A real, measurable magnetic anomaly does sit beneath the crater floor. This wasn't a surprise to the scientists involved, and it isn't unique to Wolfe Creek either. Impact structures of this size produce what geophysicists call a magnetic low, with almost predictable regularity. The same signature has been recorded at Arizona's Meteor Crater, at Manitoba's West Hawk Lake Crater, and at multiple impact sites across Finland. The cause isn't buried alien technology. It's the physical aftermath of the impact itself, shattered, lower density rock beneath the crater floor, and demagnetized or disrupted iron bearing minerals in the target rock, altered by the sheer pressure and heat of the original explosion. The 2003 survey didn't just confirm the anomaly existed. It helped researchers determine that the true crater floor lies roughly 120 to 150 metres beneath the visible surface, buried under decades' worth of drifting desert sand. Even the crater's scientific credentials weren't accepted without a fight. In the mid-1960s, some researchers argued that Wolfe Creek was missing several of the textbook microscopic signatures typically used to confirm a meteorite impact, features like shatter cones and specific fracture patterns in quartz crystals. Later surveys, in the early 2000s, identified exactly those features on the crater's southwestern rim, settling much of that debate. This is worth pausing on, because it is easy to imagine this kind of disagreement as evidence of a cover-up, or a mystery too big to explain. It's the opposite. It's what rigorous science actually looks like. Researchers publicly disagreeing, testing each other's claims, and revising their conclusions as better evidence arrives, all while the one piece of proof nobody seriously disputed. The meteorite fragments themselves sat there the entire time, technically settling the question from the very beginning. So, no aliens, no curse, no supernatural force disrupting compasses out of malice, just a genuine, scientifically confirmed anomaly, hiding in plain sight, with a scientific explanation more than half a century in the making. But that still leaves the original question hanging in the air. If none of this is supernatural, why does this place still feel, to nearly everyone who visits it, so unmistakably dangerous? Because it is, just not for the reasons anyone expected. Strip away every myth about Wolfe Creek Crater, and what's left underneath is not a lesser story. It might be a more dangerous one. Start with simple geography. Wolfe Creek Crater sits 145 kilometres from Halls Creek, itself a small, remote outback town, not a major population centre with hospitals and infrastructure. The only realistic way to reach the crater is along the Tanami Road, a route that stretches over 1,000 kilometres between Halls Creek and Alice Springs. The majority of it unsealed dirt and gravel, carved by corrugations, loose gravel, and deep dust-filled potholes locally known as bull dust. On some stretches of this network, the distance between fuel stops runs to several hundred kilometres. The final approach to the crater itself is a roughly 23-kilometre unsealed track that local guides bluntly describe as being in atrocious condition. This is not a road that forgives mistakes. Large sections of the Tanami are routinely closed between November and April, the region's wet season, when sudden. Heavy rain can wash out sections of track within hours and strand travellers for days with nowhere to go. Even in the dry season, conditions can turn without warning. Travellers have described setting out on a clear morning only to have catastrophic bushfire danger ratings declared by mid-afternoon, shutting down every road in the region simultaneously, cutting off both the route forward and the route back. Mobile phone coverage across most of this country is effectively non-existent. If something goes wrong here, a mechanical failure, a medical emergency, a vehicle bogged in sand, the nearest help may be hours away, and reaching it at all depends entirely on how well prepared you were before you left the highway. Then there's the heat. Daytime temperatures through the dry season regularly climb past 40 degrees Celsius, with essentially no shade anywhere along the crater's exposed rim or floor. Dehydration and heat-related illness are, according to Australian tourism authorities themselves, the single most common real danger visitors face here a far more statistically significant threat than anything a horror film ever invented. Add in the venomous snakes and other wildlife typical of this stretch of the Kimberley, and the terrain inside the crater itself, loose. Broken scree along the inner walls, and softer, unstable ground around the central sinkholes after rain, and you have a location that punishes carelessness in very ordinary, very well understood ways. Experienced outback travellers heading into this country are consistently advised to carry significant reserves of fuel and water well beyond what the direct distance would suggest, along with a satellite phone or an emergency beacon, precisely because ordinary mobile networks cannot be relied upon here. None of these precautions exist because the crater is cursed. They exist because the desert surrounding it does not forgive poor preparation, and never has. None of this required a single supernatural explanation. It required nothing more exotic than heat, distance, and geology, stacked together in a place with almost no margin for error. And this is exactly where the ancient and the modern stop contradicting each other and start unexpectedly agreeing. The Djaru and Walmajari custodians of this country never needed a satellite forecast or a geophysical survey to understand that Kandimalal demanded caution. Their law encoded that caution directly into the story itself, a place where a star fell from the sky in violence, where the people stayed away out of genuine fear before daring to approach, where the ground itself carries the memory of catastrophe. That is not a superstition standing in the way of the facts. It is a functioning safety framework, refined and transmitted across an almost unimaginable span of time, teaching successive generations to treat this specific stretch of desert with the seriousness it has always deserved. Modern science arrived at a strikingly similar conclusion, just from a completely different direction. Where the old stories warn through narrative, a falling star, a terrifying noise, a place people avoided until they were ready to face it, the modern account warns through data, extreme temperatures, 1,000 kilometres of largely unsealed road, medical help hours or days away, and a landscape capable of turning a survivable mistake into a genuine emergency within a matter of hours. Neither of these is a ghost story. Both of them are asking for exactly the same thing. Don't come here unprepared, and don't treat this place, or this land, lightly. That is the real, grounded, and quietly unsettling truth hiding inside Wolfe Creek Crater. Not aliens, not curses, not a void beneath the sand hiding something science can't explain. Just an extraordinarily powerful ancient impact in one of the most remote and demanding environments on the planet, a combination the Djaru and Walmatjari people understood and respected tens of thousands of years before anyone else even knew this place existed. There's something genuinely rare about a place like Wolfe Creek Crater somewhere that holds two completely different kinds of truth at once and lets them stand side by side without ever really contradicting each other. On one hand, a peer-reviewed paper using cosmogenic isotopes to date a 120,000-year-old impact down to the level of scientific certainty. On the other, a story about a falling star and a terrified crescent moon, carried by voice alone across an almost incomprehensible stretch of human generations, arriving at very nearly the same understanding. Maybe that's the real hidden anomaly here. Not a mystery that needs solving, but a reminder of how much two entirely different systems of knowledge, one built on data, the other built on memory and law, can actually agree on when you're willing to take both of them seriously. The Djaru and Walmatjari people never needed satellites or dating labs to know this was a place that demanded respect. Science eventually caught up. The desert, in the meantime, never stopped being exactly as dangerous and exactly as extraordinary as both of them always said it was. We want to know what you think. Does it surprise you how closely the old story lines up with the modern science? Let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into one of Australia's most remarkable landmarks, make sure you're subscribed, because there are a lot more hidden anomalies out there still waiting to be uncovered.